Well, hello, and a very warm good morning from Economics and Birdsong, my new podcast. I was thinking last night that it would be nice to do a video cast of my thoughts on economics, and I was wondering where to do it, and then I realised that I had a garden, and in the garden the birds sang quite beautifully. There are blackbirds, song thrushes, even the odd pigeon, and they produce a beautiful symphony of song, especially at dawn and dusk. And since I wanted to talk in the mornings, and possibly the evenings, it seemed like a good time to do it. So even if you don't like economics, there's birdsong, and if you don't like birdsong, there's economics, and I'm thinking that I'm covering most of the bases there. So today, what am I going to discuss? Well, today I want to discuss climate policy because I've been reading a good book on it. It's called Global Carbon Pricing, and it's edited by 4 authors, including David Mackay and Stephen Stoft. David Mackay, you might recall, was a professor at physics in Cambridge who wrote a book on sustainable energy. Was promoted to Chief Scientific Advisor to the Department of Energy and Climate Change, and unfortunately he died way before his time a few years ago, in 2016, of cancer. So I've been reading his book, or the book that he co-edited with 3 other co-editors, and it's very good. Really, Mackay and his co-authors make about 3 major points. The first point is that we need a climate policy framework that rewards reciprocation and trust. In other words, if you do something good, then I can do it too. Now, reciprocation is normal in everyday life. So if you go to the shop, you buy something and then you reciprocate. That's a reciprocation. So you get something nice, something that you want, and you pay for it. Now you say, "Oh, that's not reciprocation. That's just buying something." But imagine then you've got a builder, and you do some work, and you don't pay him. Like, you actually sort of have that option, but if not, he's going to get very angry with you, and he's going to eventually take you to court or tell everyone else that you're not someone who pays. So reciprocation also happens between friends. You might go around to someone's house for a couple of drinks, and then you invite them back to your place for a couple of drinks the next time, and so forth. Or in the pub, I buy a round of drinks, they buy a round back. So reciprocation is quite normal, and we need a framework for it. And they also talk about multilateral reciprocation, so when you have many players in the game. And that relates a little bit to a topic in my book, which is the social contract, and in particular what Beveridge did. But enough of that. I will, if you will, is the framework. And they also make the point that if you don't have reciprocation, a strong reciprocation framework in place, you can actually get people getting unhappy and basically start off being quite altruistic, so making pledges and commitments for the climate, but if nobody reciprocates, they actually get disillusioned, and so even the good guys can get basically lose their altruism if you don't have a good framework of reciprocation. Okay, so that's the first point. You need a framework with reciprocation. Second point is to make the case for carbon pricing. So what is carbon pricing? Well, carbon pricing is putting a tax or an emissions trading scheme on emissions of greenhouse gases internal to a country. So basically it means that industry, where you have a market economy, pays a tax or an extra cost of emitting greenhouse gas emissions or burning carbon, because of course the major greenhouse gas is carbon dioxide, which is due to burning the carbon in fossil fuels. So if you have a nice framework for carbon pricing, that's a good way to make sure that the most dirty fuels are not burnt. In other words, it prioritises those forms of greenhouse gas mitigation, i.e. burning less of the carbon, that are cheapest. So for example, burning brown coal or lignite, which is a form of coal that's a bit like peat. It's coal that's not being compressed as much. It's a sort of dirty, peaty sort of coal that's brown and a little softer than the hard black coal that is perhaps more familiar. This form of electricity generation is the dirtiest. I mean, it's more dirty than burning coal, black coal. And there's plenty of this coal in Germany and Poland, and so even though Germany has been expanding the use of renewable energy, it's also been carrying on burning this brown coal. So if they had a carbon tax, that would just be cut out straight away, because the emissions per unit of electricity are so high that just a small carbon tax of say €10 or €20 a tonne of CO2 would increase the cost of lignite by about 2 cents, US cents, which is almost enough to cut it out entirely. Certainly at a standard rate of $100 a tonne of CO2, which is what Chris Hope suggests, that would increase it by 10 cents, US cents, which would be enough to cut it out of any electricity mix. And that's also the same with coal, black coal. $100 a tonne of CO2 is enough to cut coal out on the whole. And that's what we would see in China. If China did impose a tax on fossil fuels equivalent to $100 a tonne of CO2, coal would be chucked out, and this would actually have plenty of other beneficial effects on their natural environment and their human environment, particularly the reduction in air pollution, which kills, according to World Health Organization figures, 8.8 million people a year die prematurely due to air pollution. So air pollution is a big deal, and carbon tax can cut out a lot of air pollution. And it's a big deal in China and India as well, more so India than China now, but still both countries have a serious air pollution problem. And that's partly because there's such high population density, there's so many people living there, 1 billion people in each. Together they take up a third of the world's population. And so that third of the world's population is choking at the moment, and a tax on carbon, a tax on coal in particular, which is the most carbon intensive form, whether black or brown coal, a tax on fossil fuels including coal will cut out coal if it's at a high enough rate, and that could save easily 3 million lives over the course of 15 years, as the IMF pointed out. That's 3 million Chinese lives saved through the use of a fossil fuel tax. And that money that was raised by the fossil fuel tax could be used in one of two ways. Firstly, it could actually be used to subsidise electricity, to reduce the cost of electricity. So that would mean that the tax doesn't increase very much the price of electricity because it's compensated. That's one option. And I generally recommend that option in many countries, perhaps even China. You might say, of course, we need to reduce electricity demand per se, in which case you don't want another option. Option B would be actually to provide a per capita dividend. So in other words, to give the money back to individuals. And perhaps a third option would be to use that money in another way, from the point which is good from the point of view of public policy. So to reduce distortions in the tax system, so to reduce labour taxes or something, or to reduce, or to provide useful public spending focused on the poor in public health matters, or in renewables support. So there, I've given you a few reasons why it's a good idea to have a carbon tax or an ETS. Now, which of the two should we have, a carbon tax or an ETS? Well, a carbon tax is better because a carbon tax can cover more entities. Usually an ETS is a downstream emissions trading scheme. In other words, it means that it's where the emissions are made, are burnt, the factories, whereas carbon tax is upstream. In other words, it's where the coal, oil and gas is extracted or comes into the country, but it's where you impose the tax. And because it's upstream, it means that more sources of emissions can be covered by the scheme. So it has a higher coverage ratio. So those are a couple of policies that are helpful, and so you have a kind of reciprocation framework, and you have the idea of carbon taxes, and you can potentially put, as the third point made by the book is that you can potentially put the two together. That kind of eliminating the Tower of Babel, the multivariate forms of that international climate commitments can be a good thing to reduce the dimensionality. So what do I mean by dimensionality? Well, in Kyoto, a long time ago, 1992, over 25 years ago, it was originally intended that there would be a common commitment, a common emissions reduction commitment. But Kyoto founded on this couple of problems. One was that the developing countries didn't want to get involved. So China, for example, saw this as a limitation on their economic growth, and they were right. It would have been a limitation on the economic growth. In fact, the business as usual emissions from China were 4 times what the Americans thought they would be in the Kyoto commitment period. They were out by a factor of 4. It's incredible. So China massively increased its emissions between 1992 and now. I mean, by a factor of 5 they went up. And that was to do with the massive development in China. But they did that without any regard to air pollution or the climate. They just built those coal power stations with potentially catastrophic effects on the world's climate. Now, the Americans in the original treaty wouldn't get involved unless China was involved. And so you had a kind of intense negotiation, a kind of I guess what I call a Tower of Babel, really, because there's lots of different interests, there's a lot of different notions of justice between these countries. And there were some people who said that actually what we need was a contraction and convergence idea, that is, that the existing baseline is taken as the status quo, and then over years we converge to the same levels of per capita emissions. I think this makes a lot of sense, to be honest. I was never a great fan of it myself because it wasn't very realpolitik, but the contraction element of it is actually sort of right. Anyway, the problem is that all the different countries have their own interests in whatever the formula is. So in the end, they couldn't agree on a formula, or at least they had a formula for the developed countries who did in fact reduce their emissions, but mostly because of the Eastern Europeans who were deindustrializing at that time due to the collapse of communism. But the developing countries weren't included, and China in particular is massively increased its emissions since the Kyoto Treaty. So the authors of the book, Global Carbon Pricing, unsurprisingly point out that a Kyoto Agreement, which actually caps people's emissions, the country's emissions, and allows over or under allows people to overachieve or underachieve their targets and sells hot air between people, and also has this thing called offsets, the clean development mechanism, which in fact still exists. That framework does allow some sort of carbon pricing, but only between countries and only on the over and underachievement of the developed countries' targets. It doesn't actually impose carbon pricing internally to a country. Now, this framework monetizes the gap between your promise and what you actually achieved. The problem with this is that it financially encourages people to commit to less. And that's exactly what you don't want. So instead we have this sort of harmonized carbon pricing sort of thing that I will if you will. It's a bit like crowdfunding actually. You know, you get a crowdfunded thing done if you do the same, if you say I will if you will. So those are the three-part elements of this book that I've read. Firstly, that we need a reciprocal arrangement. Secondly, that we need carbon pricing internal to a country. And thirdly, that a harmonised form of carbon pricing, for example, one where the agreed upon carbon price is dependent on the commitments of everyone else. So you agree to implement a carbon price at least as great as the minimum level committed by the other elements of the group. That sort of commitment scheme is likely to be the one that makes things work. Now, it's still not clear to me if we need a system just like that, like a simple harmonised tax system based on the minimum level committed by any of the participants, or we need a sort of dual level system where you have this kind of coalition of the willing, to use Blair and Bush's hackneyed phrase. The coalition of the willing go away and do their thing, and perhaps impose some sort of penalties on those outside the scheme. Right, well that's something for you to think about. Please mention it in the comments, as they say, and I'll wish you a very good morning and a wonderful week wherever you are around the world.